The machine was huge, but it had an appearance of simple construction. A large rectangular block of what appeared to be a strange black metal was set on end, and flanked on each side by two smaller ones. On top of a large block was set a half-globe of strange substance, somewhat, Henry thought, like frosted glass. On one side of a large cube was set a lever, a long glass panel, two vertical tubes, and three clock face indicators. The control board, it appeared, was relatively simple. Beside the mass of the 5 rectangles on the floor was a large plate of transparent substance, ground to a concave surface, below which one could see an intricate tangle of wire mesh. Hanging from the ceiling directly above the one on the floor was another concave disc, but this one had a far more pronounced curvature. Wires connected the two discs, and each in turn was connected to the rectangular machine.
It is a matter of the proper utilization of two forces, electrical and gravitational,
proudly explained Dr. White.
Those two forces properly used warp the third dimensional into the fourth. A reverse process is used to return the object to the third. The principle of a machine is...
The old man was about to launch into a lengthy discussion, but Henry interrupted him. A glance at his watch had shown him press time was drawing perilously close. "Just a second," he said. "You propose to warp a third-dimensional being into a fourth dimension. How could a third-dimensional thing exist there? You said a short time ago that only a specified dimension could exist on one single plane."
"You have missed my point,"
snapped Dr. White.
"I am not sending a third-dimensional thing to a fourth dimension. I am changing the third-dimensional being into a fourth-dimensional being. I add a dimension, and automatically the being exists on a different plane. I am reversing evolution. The third dimension we now exist on evolved millions of eons ago from a fourth dimension. I am sending a lesser entity back over those millions of eons to a plane similar to one upon which his ancestors lived inconceivably long ago."
"But man, how do you know you can do it?" The doctor's eyes gleamed and his fingers reached out to press a bell. A servant appeared almost at once.
"Bring me a dog,"
snapped the old man. The servant disappeared.
"Young man,"
said Dr. White,
"I am going to show you how I know I can do it. I have done it before. Now I am going to do it for you. I have sent dogs and cats back to the fourth dimension and returned them safely to this room. I can do it the same with men."
The servant reappeared, carrying in his arms a small dog. The doctor stepped to the control board of his strange machine.
"All right, George," he said.
The servant had evidently worked with the old man enough to know what was expected of him. He stepped close to the floor disc and waited. The dog whined softly, sensing that all was not exactly right. The old scientist slowly shoved the lever toward the right, and as he did so a faint hum filled the room, rising to a stupendous roar as he advanced the lever. From both floor disc and upper disc leaped strange cones of blue light which met midway to form an hourglass shape of brilliance. The light did not waver or sparkle, nor did it glow. It seemed hard and brittle like straight bars of force. The newspaper man, gazing with awe upon it, felt the terrific force was there. What had that old man said? Warp a third-dimensional being into another dimension? That would take force. As he watched, petrified by the spectacle, the servant stepped forward and with a flip tossed the little dog into the blue light. The animal could be discerned for a moment through the light and then disappeared.
"Look, in the globe!"
shouted the old man, and Henry jerked his eyes from the column of light to the half-globe atop the machine. He gasped. In the globe, deep within its milky centre, glowed a picture that made his brain reel as he looked upon it. It was a scene such as no man could have imagined unaided. It was a horribly distorted projection of an eccentric landscape, a landscape hardly analogues to anything on Earth. "That's the fourth dimension, sir," said the servant.
"That's not the fourth dimension,"
the old man corrected him.
"That's a third-dimensional impression of the fourth dimension. It is no more the fourth dimension than a shadow is three-dimensional. It, like a shadow, is merely a projection. It gives us a glimpse of what the fourth plane is like. It is a shadow of that plane."
Slowly a dark blotch began to grow in the landscape. Slowly it assumed a definitive form. It puzzled the reporter. It looked familiar. He could have sworn he had seen it somewhere before. It was alive, for it had moved. "That, sir, is the dog," George volunteered.
That was the dog.
Dr. White corrected him.
God knows what it is now.
He turned to the newspaper man.
Have you seen enough?
He demanded. Henry nodded. The other slowly began to return the lever to its original position. The roaring subsided, the light faded, the projection in the half-globe grew fainter. "How are you going to use it?" asked the newspaper man.
I have 98 men who have agreed to be projected into the fourth dimension to seek out the entities that are attacking us and attack them in turn. I shall send them out in an hour.
"Where is there a phone?" asked the newspaper man.
In the next room,
replied Dr. White. As the reporter dashed out of the door, the light faded entirely from between the two discs, and on the lower one a little dog crouched, quivering, softly whimpering. The old man stepped from the controls and approached the disc. He scooped the little animal from where it lay into his arms and patted the silky head.
Good dog,
he murmured, and the creature snuggled close to him, comforted, already forgetting that horrible place from which it had just returned.
Is everything ready, George?
asked the old man. Yes, sir, replied the servant. The men are all ready, even anxious to go. If you ask me, sir, they are a tough lot.
They are as brave a group of men as ever graced the earth,
replied the scientist gently.
They are adventurers, every one of whom has faced danger and will not shrink from it. They are born fighters. My one regret is that I have not been able to secure more like them. 1,000 men such as they should be able to conquer any opponent, but it was impossible. The other were poor soft fools. They laughed in my face. They thought I was an old fool, I, the man who alone stands between them and utter destruction.
His voice had risen to almost a scream, but it again sank to a normal tone.
I may be sending 98 brave men to instant death. I hope not.
You can always jerk them back, sir, suggested George.
Maybe I can, maybe not,
murmured the old man. Henry Woods appeared in the doorway. When do we start? He asked.
We?
Exclaimed the scientist. Certainly, you don't believe you're going to leave me out of this? Why, man, it's the greatest story of all time. I'm going as special war correspondent.
They believed it? They are going to publish it?
Cried the old man, clutching at the newspaper man's sleeve. Well, the editor was sceptical at first, but after I swore on all sorts of oaths it was true, he ate it up. Maybe you think that story didn't stop the presses?
I didn't expect them to. I just took a chance. I thought they too would laugh at me.
But when do we start? Persisted Henry.
You are really in earnest? You really want to go?
Asked the old man unbelievingly. I am going. Try to stop me. Dr. White glanced at his watch.
We will start in exactly 34 minutes, he said.
10 seconds to go. George, standing with watch in hand, spoke in a precise manner, the very crispness of his words betraying the excitement under which he laboured. The blue light hissing drove from disc to disc. The room thundered with the roar of the machine, before which stood Dr. White, his hand on the lever, his eyes glued on the instruments before him. In a line stood the men who were to fling themselves into the light to be warped into another dimension, there to seek out and fight an unknown enemy. The line was headed by a tall man, whose hands like hams, with a weather-beaten face and a wild mop of hair. Behind him stood a belligerent little cockney. Henry Wood stood fifth in line. They were a motley lot, adventurers every one of them, and some were obviously afraid as they stood before that column of light. With only a few seconds of a third dimension left to them, they had answered a weird advertisement, and had but a limited idea of what they were about to do. Grimly, though they accepted it as a job, a bizarre job, but a job, they faced it as they faced other equally dangerous but less unusual jobs. 5 seconds, snapped George. The lever was all the way over now. The half-globe showed within its milky interior a hideously distorted landscape. The light had taken on a hard, brittle appearance, and its hiss had risen to a scream. The machine thundered steadily, with a suggestion of horrible power. Time up! The tall man stepped forward. His foot reached the disc. Another step, and he was bathed in the light. A third, and he glimmered momentarily, then vanished. Close on his heels followed the little Cockney. With his nerves at almost a snapping point, Henry moved on behind the fourth man. He was horribly afraid. He wanted to break from the line and run. It didn't matter where, any place to get away from that steady, steely light in front of him. He had seen 3 men into it, glow for a second and then disappear. A fourth man had placed his foot on the disc. Cold sweat stood out on his brow. Like an automaton, he placed one foot on the disc. The fourth man had already disappeared. "Snap into it, pal," growled the man behind. Henry lifted the other foot, caught his toe on the edge of the disc, and stumbled headlong into the column of light. He was conscious of intense heat, which was instantly followed by equally intense cold. For a moment his body seemed to be under enormous pressure, then it seemed to be expanding, flying apart, bursting, exploding. He felt solid ground under his feet, and his eyes snapping open saw an alien land. It was a land of sombre colour, with great grey moors and beetling black cliffs. There was something queer about it, an intangible quality that baffled him. He looked about him, expecting to see his companions. He saw no one. He was absolutely alone in that desolate, brooding land. Something dreadful had happened. Was he the only one to be safely transported from the third dimension? Had some horrible accident occurred? Was he alone? Sudden panic seized him. If something had happened, if the others were not here, might it not be possible that the machine would not be able to bring him back to his own dimension? Was he doomed to remain marooned forever in this terrible plane? He looked down at his body and gasped in dismay. It was not his body! It was a grotesque caricature of a body, a horrible profane mass of flesh, like a phantasmagoric beast snatched from the dreams of a lunatic. It was real, however. He felt it with his hands, but they were not his hands. They were something like hands. They served the same purpose that hands served in the third dimension. He was, he realized, a being of the fourth dimension, but in his fourth dimensional brain still clung hard-fighting remnants of that faithful old third dimensional brain. He could not as yet see with fourth dimensional eyes or think purely with fourth dimensional thoughts. He had not oriented himself as yet to this new plane of existence. He was seeing the fourth dimension through the blurred lenses of millions of eons of third dimensional existence. He was seeing it much more clearly than he had seen it in the half-globe atop the machine in Dr. White's laboratory, but he would not see it clearly until every vestige of the third dimension was wiped from him. That, he knew, would come in time. He felt his weird body with those things that served as hands, and he found beneath his groping, unearthly fingers great rolling muscles, powerful tendons, and hard, well-conditioned flesh. A sense of well-being surged through him, and he growled like an animal of that horrible fourth plane. But the terrible sounds that came from between his slobbering lips were not those of his own voice, but those of many men. Then he knew he was not alone. Here in this one body were the bodies, the brains, the power, the spirit of those other 90 men. In the fourth dimension, all the millions of third dimensional things were one. Perhaps that particular portion of the third dimension called the Earth had sprung from or degenerated from one single unit of a dissolving, worn-out fourth dimension. The third dimension, warped back to a higher plane, was automatically obeying the mystic laws of evolution by reforming in the shape of that old ancestor unimaginably removed in time from the race he had begot. He was no longer Henry Wood's newspaper man. He was an entity that had given birth in the dim ages when the Earth was born to a third dimension. Nor was he alone. This body of his was composed of other sons of that ancient entity. He felt himself grow, felt his body grow vaster, assume great proportions that felt new vitality flow through him. It was the other men, the men who were flinging themselves into the column of light in the laboratory to be warped back to this plane to be incorporated in his body. It was not his body, however. His brain was not his alone. The pronoun, he realized, represented the sum total of those other men, his fellow adventurers. Suddenly, a new feeling came, a feeling of completeness, a feeling of supreme fitness. He knew that the last of the 98 men had stepped across the disc, that all were here in this giant body. Now he could see more clearly things in the landscape which had escaped him before. Awful thoughts ran through his brain, heavy, ponderous black thoughts. He began to recognize the landscape as something familiar, something he had seen before, a thing which he was intimate. Phenomena which his third-dimensional intelligence would have gasped at became commonplace. He was finally seeing through fourth-dimensional eyes, thinking fourth-dimensional thoughts. Memory seeped into his brain, and he had fleeting visions of dark caverns lit by hellish flames, of huge seas that battered remorselessly with mile-high waves against towering headlands that reared titanic toward a glowering sky. He remembered a red desert scattered with scarlet boulders. He remembered silver cliffs of gleaming metallic stone. Through all his thoughts ran something else, a scarlet thread of hate, an all-consuming passion, a fierce lust after the life of some other entity. He was no longer a composite thing built of third-dimensional beings. He was a creature of another plane, a creature with a consuming hate, and suddenly he knew against whom this hate was directed and why. He knew also that this creature was near, and his great fists closed and then spread wide as he knew it. How did he know it? Perhaps through some sense which he, as a being of another plane, held but which was alien to the earth. Later he asked himself this question. At the time, however, there was no questioning on his part. He only knew that somewhere near was a hated enemy, and he did not question the source of his knowledge.